Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Klingenfeld and I work at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. After we've learned in episode 1 about the possibilities and also challenges of financing a global transformation towards sustainability, I will now take up in episode 2 the role of carbon markets specifically and expand on a couple of points that Professor Schubert has already alluded to. After the end of my talk, in terms of learning outcomes, you will be able to understand why a well-designed policy framework is needed for initiating the global transformation and for sustaining it. More particularly, you will know about the essential role of carbon pricing within an overall policy mix. I will give you the arguments to be able to explain the difference between price-based and quantity-based regulation, and based on their relative advantages and disadvantages, you will understand why carbon pricing by way of a carbon market is a preferred option. Speaking more about the political landscape, you will also learn how to expand carbon markets globally, looking at different strategies on a stepwise approach and to a more global approach. And finally, you will understand why additional policy instruments are needed to complement carbon pricing strategies in a broader policy mix. The content of my presentation follows the learning outcomes, and I would like first now to begin by talking about market failures as barriers to investment. And in fact, there are a number of market failures that hamper the global transformation process and that really require government intervention, a number of government policies to address a whole set of market failures. What's a market failure? In fact, a market failure precludes that markets operate efficiently and bring about a socially desirable outcome. In the context of a global transformation, probably the biggest market failure and the biggest challenge is the public goods character of the atmosphere and of providing a stable climate system. To explain this, in a way, climate policies and climate mitigation are being undertaken by some individual actors. They bear the costs, but the benefits of reducing emissions are really shared globally. And as a result of this structure of costs that occur individually and benefits that are being shared globally, there's less mitigation undertaken than would be socially desirable. So this explains, or this characterizes the big challenge of the atmosphere as a public good and a market failure to be addressed. Related to this point is the question of externalities. I will come back to this point in more detail at a later slide. The point of externalities was already taken up by Professor Schubert. It characterizes a situation where the market prices that producers and consumers face do not take into account damages that are being borne elsewhere by society. A further market failure related to the global transformation process are information asymmetries. And more specifically there, the information differences between borrowers and lenders of capital, which make it difficult to allocate capital in a socially efficient way. Natural monopolies are a further challenge. The electricity grid is an example of a natural monopoly. Indeed, once a grid is in place, it is very hard, if not impossible, for new competitors to enter the market and to build a competing infrastructure, because the capital requirements and the investments are so large that it also would not make sense from a socially optimal perspective to basically build two competing grids and then to let them basically appear on the market. That's why regulation is important to regulate those natural monopolies. And finally, there's transaction costs. Also coming back to the question of allocating capital, transaction costs to really match lenders and borrowers of capital to advance the global transformation process. So taking all this together, all these challenges, they lead, absent any government policies, to an inefficient allocation of resources. And that's where a balanced policy mix comes into play. And I will come to this next. Talking about instruments for managing the global transformation process. So what options do governments have in order to address market failures and in order to enhance the operation of markets around the world related to this global transformation process? Well, in fact, there are 4 different sets of political and economic instruments at the disposal of governments, and I would like to highlight them to explain them now to you. They are first regulatory instruments, then incentive instruments, information instruments, and government investment. So starting with the first one, regulatory instruments, this category is also known as mandates or command and control policies. And these two names already indicate that we are talking here about rather prescriptive policy interventions that mandate very specific outcomes for companies and consumers. As an example, we can talk about, for example, efficiency standards for buildings, so minimum building codes, or also efficiency standards for cars that set minimum requirements, industry performance standards that have to be met or exceeded. So companies basically cannot circumvent this regulation, and they have to respond to it. And so it's a fairly direct intervention in the market. The second category of instruments, incentive instruments, give more flexibility for consumers and businesses on how to respond to regulation. And also the question of carbon markets that I'll be talking about follows in this second category of incentive instruments. So examples include here taxes, subsidies, or user charges. By these measures, basically, governments try to change relative prices. They tax a certain activity, for example, associated with CO2 emissions, so as to increase the relative price of this activity vis-à-vis other activities that are not related to harmful external effects. And by doing so, governments set an incentive for changes in user and producer behavior, but they don't mandate a certain outcome. So in the end, consumers and producers are still free to choose how they desire, how they want to invest, what they want to purchase, but the incentive structure certainly changes. The third segment and the third category I would like to highlight here are information instruments. Very well-known strategy that I'm sure you're all aware is labeling of appliances. I'm sure everyone has already seen like a sticker on a refrigerator or on a washing machine indicating a certain energy performance level. Normally it's done in letters from A to B or C, or even A++, as we have in Europe at the moment, as an information sticker that gives you a certain indication where this specific product basically fits into the overall efficiency level as compared to other products. It gives you more information to orient your consumption decisions, but it doesn't mandate anything. It just gives you more information so that you can make informed choices. And there are other ways, of course, to do so. There can be information even on broader questions such as climate change, on websites, so on and so forth, in order to alert citizens, in order to make them aware of certain trade-offs for them to make educated choices in their daily lives. The final category here are government investments. This is a very direct, basically, government intervention by, for example, investing directly in technology demonstration projects, by advancing research and development, by showing that a certain technology is viable, allowing further studies on it. So to directly take government money and basically put it into a demonstration project. But even beyond that, a very important area for government investments are public infrastructure investments. For example, if governments invest in high-speed rail systems or in public transport, this can have a huge effect on advancing the transformation to sustainability. So this is to show you the overall instrument mix available for governments, and I would like now to talk more specifically about the role of carbon pricing within this policy mix. And here I come back to the issue of externalities that was already mentioned by Professor Schubert, and that I also took up when talking about market failures related to the global transformation process. And I would like to illustrate the challenge here in a little bit more detail with this graph that you see here on this slide, and talk about externalities from fossil fuel consumption. So for a moment, let's forget about externalities and just think about a normal market for a good, let's say, electricity that is being produced in association with CO2 emissions. For example, in a coal-fired power plant, coal is being burned, electricity is produced. On this graph here, you have on the x-axis an amount of CO2 emissions increasing from left to right. And on the y-axis, you've got different labels for marginal costs from a producer's perspective, so in this case, the coal company, marginal benefits from a societal perspective, in this case, electricity customers, and then this is both expressed in terms of price. So what we see here, let's first start with this downward sloping green curve, which is the marginal benefits curve from a societal perspective for CO2 emissions, and we should say for using electricity produced with CO2 emissions. It's, according to standard economic theory, downward sloping. At a rather high price, the quantity asked for on the market is rather small, because only the most valuable uses for electricity are being undertaken by customers. And as much as the price decreases, the demand for CO2 increases for electricity as more and more users find it beneficial to use electricity for certain services that they require at home and elsewhere. Conversely, you've got the supply curve from a company's perspective, and that's the blue curve at the bottom, the upward sloping curve. And that's also, according to standard economic theory, the more you produce in terms of, in this case, power with CO2 emissions, the more expensive your marginal costs become, because you may be tapping more deeper coal seams. So that's just standard economic theory, that this is an upward sloping curve. And at the intersection, what you get is the market clearing price. This is here the point given by X2, quantity X2, and the price P2. But isn't there something missing? This is the big question. That's where externalities come into play. And indeed, there's something big missing. Because all the negative effects that the CO2 emissions that are being released engender, for example, in terms of accelerating climate change, contributing to increased sea level rise, increasing the likelihood of extreme events such as droughts and floods, all these damages that result from overall CO2 emissions, of course, globally and over time, they are not being paid for by the parties that do the transaction in this case. So they're not being paid for by the producer of electricity, nor by the consumer in this case. And this is what we call a negative externality that we normally would have to take into account. And we can do this, or we can at least express this externality, by shifting the supply curve of the producer upward. And by this accounting for the costs, the additional costs that every unit of CO2 released entails in this case. And so what we get here is a new market clearing price and a new quantity that is indicated by the point A. So what we see here is that we have a lower quantity of emissions, and the service provided, the electricity, comes at a higher price that really takes into account all the social costs. So this is the concept of externalities. And maybe a last point on this slide, why is this socially beneficial? I mean, now we've got the shaded figures here. We could say, of course, we are losing out on some degree of social benefits, of social welfare, indicated by the dark orange shape and given by the endpoints A, B, X2 and X1. But keep in mind that producing this extra quantity, as we had done in the initial case without the externality, requires the overall inputs of the shape AC, X2, X1, so that overall bigger shape. And so the costs outweigh the benefits, and that's why it's from a social perspective more beneficial to go back to the price and quantity point A. Moving on, so what do we do then in order to internalize this externality? And well, the solution is, in a way, to put a price on CO2 emissions in the proportions so that to exactly match the social costs with that additional price increase. And the mechanism by which this works is that consumers see, or first producers see, a higher price for their output of electricity, so they face higher costs, which they have to pass through to consumers in order to stay in business. And so consumers see a higher price, they react to it, they substitute. For example, they may use electricity from renewable sources not associated with CO2 emissions. And so in the end, we come to this behavior that shifts back the quantity and raises up the price. Now the question is, how do we come to this price on CO2 emissions? And various strategies are possible here. And I'd like to talk about the two main strategies, which are price regulation and quantity regulation. Now, probably the most intuitive one is price regulation in the form of putting a price on CO2 in the form of a tax. In an ideal world, we would, of course, then know the two curves where they would sit exactly, and we could measure basically the difference between a company level perspective and a society level perspective, and really take this delta and set this as the tax rate. And by doing so, we would then contribute to internalizing the social cost of emitting carbon dioxide. So this would be the first case and probably the most intuitive one. There's a second option that we could choose and that I will elaborate on in even more detail, and that's called quantity regulation. What we could do conversely is not to look at the price, but to look at the quantity that we would like to allow in terms of pollution, in terms of emissions, and establish something that is called a cap and trade system. We set an overall limit, and we divide this overall quantity that we still allow into into smaller parts of allowances, usually expressed by 1 ton, emissions of 1 ton of CO2, which we then, in a textbook case, we would sell this quantity to the producers of emissions. They would have to purchase, probably by way of auction, they would have to purchase these certificates. And so by setting the scarcity, by limiting the overall amount, we are actually creating a value of those permits. So they get a price, and it's only in an indirect way that we would be putting a price on CO2. And it could lead to the same result, as I will point out in a moment. Those permits are then traded on a market where normally the regulated companies participate, but that's not exclusive. It can really be opened to many private and corporate entities trading on this market in order to provide liquidity, as is being done on the oil market and many other markets in the world, where not only those who are really using the oil are the traders. So this can be done on a wider level. And the result of this operation can be much the same as in the case with the tax. By creating or by inducing a price for emitting CO2, you're also having an effect on the producer's cost for providing a certain product, which will then be passed through to consumers and lead to a certain change in behavior and a reduction in the consumption of this product and the emissions associated with it. Now, the tricky thing is that in both cases, we don't know the exact shape of the company supply curves, but even more so the social marginal cost curves. This is uncertain. And so in the case of a cap setting, a quantity regulation, what we would need to do is to get as close as possible to the socially optimal point. This is just here the illustration to indicate that we are moving from the point x2 to a point x1 that is lower in terms of CO2 emissions than the point x2, as closely as possible to the optimum point x star that is given here on this graph, where the marginal cost curve on a societal basis intersects with the marginal benefits curve that I highlighted in the initial graph. If we know the shape of the curves, in theory, both instruments are equivalent. And I would like already to highlight a groundbreaking study of Martin Weitzman that is also given in the references that he published in 1974 that looks at this case but also extends the analysis to uncertainty. And I will explain the differences as I go along. But there's, as I said, there's important literature that you can look at if you're also interested in the mathematics behind the two different cases. In this case, on this slide, where we know the shape of the curves, the two instruments can indeed be equivalent. The first case with the tax, I already pointed out how it works. We select a tax that is given here by the Greek letter pi, this green area. It shifts the supply curve upwards, and we correct the quantity from x2 to x1, and the price also moves up to the new market equilibrium given by the point B. On the right-hand side of this graph, you see the solution with a quantity regulation, where the regulator would not then set the price on the y-axis, but would look at the quantity on the x-axis. So it would only be that a total quantity of x1 emissions would be allowed. And in our graph, this would basically tilt the supply curve inwards, and it would become vertical at a point where we got the quantity x1, so at the maximum allowable quantity. No further quantities could be issued or could be sold on the market because the price would become infinite. There are no permits for it. And the end result would also be a resulting permit price, which is just the same as in our tax case. So in principle, the two instruments could be equivalent. You could pick one. It wouldn't matter which one. So while under conditions of perfect certainty, both instruments are equivalent, there are major differences in reality. And I would like to explain now advantages and disadvantages of both instruments in a case where we don't know exactly the shape of the marginal cost curve from a societal perspective. And that's the case we are facing when we talk about climate change and externalities. In case of a CO2 tax, the major advantage is certainly that consumers and producers have certainty on their cost exposure over the time frame of the tax. So basically, if you have your emissions quantity and you know the tax rate, you know exactly your cost exposure at the end of the year, at the end of the reporting period. On the downside, you have uncertainty from a societal perspective on the overall emissions outcome. And this is because there are a few uncertainties that interact. And one, for example, would be the rate of economic growth that we cannot predict exactly, and that would have consequences on the resulting emissions, even if you have a set tax rate on your emissions. Related to this, on a more global level, is also the evolution of the global population, which certainly also has effects on economic growth in the end. And the third point, a very important one, is also the rate of technological progress of substitute technologies. When I come back to the example of power production from coal, a substitute would be to produce electricity from wind or solar. So the evolution of costs of these technologies has a major, of course, effect on the overall mitigation outcome, on the overall reduction of emissions at a certain tax rate. Now if I come to the second instrument, cap and trade system, here really the advantages and disadvantages are reversed if we compare it to a tax solution. You have certainty on the environmental outcome. By setting a certain cap, and if the system is well enforced, of course, you know exactly at the end of your trading period what emissions outcome, what emissions result you will get. And here the uncertainty lies on the price for those factors that are the same that I pointed out in the tax case. So again, the question of technological progress, economic growth, population growth, they all give uncertainty on the price and lead to certain fluctuations in the market. What we see, for example, now with the European Union's emissions trading system. I'll come back to that point. Now the question is which uncertainty weighs more? Which uncertainty actually should be taken into account more seriously? And the question is whether we actually favor then a price-based regulation in the form of a CO2 tax or a quantity-based regulation in the form of a cap-and-trade system. And we believe in our report that quantity-based regulation should be given preference, especially in a global perspective. Now, why is that? I'm sure that in one of the first lectures you heard about the global environmental guardrail of keeping global average temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius as compared to pre-industrial times. And if we calculate back from this global guardrail, we can derive a fixed global emissions budget that can then basically be implemented through a cap-and-trade system on the global level and be made tradable. So the main argument here would really be to privilege the environmental uncertainty and to make sure not to cross certain thresholds. And this you can only ensure with an appropriate quantity regulation. A further advantage would be more of political nature, and that's an argument if we think about international relations, and if we introduce also elements of equity in global burden sharing. It could be argued that especially poorer countries in this world that don't have the GDP per capita or the financial means to introduce such systems because their population would not be able to support price increases for fossil fuels in the proportions required maybe under such an approach, that such countries would need to receive financial transfer payments. And they could come from a global pool of tax collection from a global tax on CO2, or they could also come from the sale of allowances of CO2 emission certificates that these countries would be allocated. Now, I would argue that the uncertainty over the long run for the stability of such a system is much greater if we think about CO2 taxes. In such case, the giving countries would have to approve these transfers every year again and again, which of course creates an uncertainty in political terms. Whereas if once set up a global trading system, one can allocate allowances over the long run. They could create property rights over decades, and so the system would be more stable. So it's in a political economy perspective, it seems more appropriate, as well as in a long-term environmental perspective. I would now like to turn to practical strategies to advance carbon markets globally, and would like to speak about 3 different options that we actually detail in our report in Chapter 7, to be correct, in Chapter 7.3.2, if you want to have a closer look at 3 different strategies. And we define in this chapter 3 different levels of ambition that are related to the political challenges of implementing these suggestions, but also that are related to the eventual transformation outcome. So the higher the level of ambition, the higher probably the political requirements for implementing these strategies, but the higher also the contribution to advancing a global transformation process. Now let's start with the first recommendation on the more modest ambition level, which is to enhance the European Union's emissions trading system. The EU ETS, as it's called in short, is the first emissions trading system for carbon dioxide emissions, and it is the biggest emissions trading system of its kind in the world. It's covering more than 10,000 different installations in Europe, mostly from the power sector and heavy industry, and covers about 45% of the total CO2 emissions of the Union. So while the system is a pioneering and very important first step, we see major areas for improvement that I would like now to highlight just to explain the bullet points here. Well, the first observation is that currently prices are trading very low, and that's not least a result of the economic recession that Europe is facing. In order to contribute to sending more credible price signals and to incentivize investments in new technologies, the price signal would need to be stronger in the European Union's emissions trading system. That's why the cap, so the amount of allowances, the amount of emission permits, should be reduced over the next years so as to bolster prices. And this can be done by reducing the amount of new permits that are being sold at auction in the years to come. So that's a first proposal that we make. The second proposal is to increase the emissions coverage of the system and to take the other 55% of the EU's CO2 emissions into the system, notably the transport sector with cars and trucks, as well as the home heating sector. These types of fuels are so far not priced with their CO2 emissions. And in order to do so, one could shift the point of regulation of the system to the level of the fuel inputs into the economy. So one could require importers of oil or gas or coal mines to purchase certificates so as to cover all CO2 uses in the economy. A second possibility for advancing carbon markets, and now in a more global perspective, would be to seek linking possibilities with other countries, other blocks of countries in the world. And there are different options for making progress when it comes to linking. One would be to advocate for sectoral or tiered approaches that, say, for example, a country like China makes an agreement with the European Union to establish a cap on its power sector and to make its certificates tradable with the ones of the European Union. And depending on the allocation of permits between China and the European Union, this could also become an attractive case for countries like China to join such a system. There are other options, for example, specifying relative targets or efficiency targets that really give you more leeway when it comes to economic growth, that don't set an absolute target. So there are many ways of making progress here, and we believe that options for linking with other partners, with other systems, should be sought. But ultimately, really, when we are serious about the 2 degrees Celsius guardrail, we know that global emissions should peak, should have their highest point before the end of this decade. And that requires really a leap in global cooperation and a much stronger incentive setting, not only in Europe, but in countries, of course, like the United States, but especially also in big emerging economies like China, India, or Brazil. And in that perspective, what we advocate is to negotiate a cap as global as possible with major partners and to bring them into the structure by offering them also an equitable distribution of allowances, not just based on past emissions, where we as Europeans have still a rather high level compared to the world average, but for example, based on an equal per capita allocation that would give countries like India a real incentive to join in such a system. So of course, this strategy would be a huge leap forward. It requires huge political capital to be invested, but in the end, it may be the only one really commensurate with a 2 degrees Celsius guardrail. I now come to the final point of my presentation and the question, what additional policy instruments should complement carbon pricing within a global carbon market? And so on this last slide, I would like to highlight and point out once again that we see carbon pricing through a cap and trade system with ambitious caps that extends as globally as possible as the core strategy for bringing about the global transformation process. But there are other market failures, and I talked about at the beginning of my presentation about other challenges that need to be addressed by governments around the world in order to bring about a socially desirable outcome and to really make progress in the direction of a low-carbon economy. For example, barriers to market entry, we see them in the electricity sector. For example, here feed-in tariffs, and Professor Schubert talked about it, could really speed up the penetration of renewable energy sources in a much faster way and also contribute to advancing technologies that on a purely carbon pricing level would not be competitive today, but are learning fast and are decreasing their cost fast. Other options include grid regulation for electricity grids, which are natural monopolies. I hinted to that. And finally, active government R&D programs in order to take into account or account for knowledge spillovers which lead to underinvestment in research and development, meaning that knowledge generated by companies is often appropriated by others without them getting compensation. So an active government policy and a balanced policy mix is really the key. So this brings me to an end. You've got here some questions for self-study to you. I won't point them out all in detail. I hope that I was able to show you that active government policies are required to scale up and to speed up the transformation process, and that carbon pricing with a global carbon market has a key role to play. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the interview.